I would guess that your institution has a career development and job placement center. In that case, one of its major objectives is to prepare and usher graduating students into the workforce. As such, the faculty and staff have a responsibility to ensure that their students are prepared to the best of the institution's abilities. That preparation should include teaching students about workplace trauma. How prepared are your students? Here is a question for employees, victims of workplace trauma and post-traumatic unemployment disorder, as well as those on mental medication from corporate trauma. Did your college or university actively and formally teach you about corporate trauma before you graduated? Question for instructors and professors. Is your institution truly preparing your students for corporate America or any type of professional place of employment? If you are a current student, from your perspective, do you feel that your college or university is actively and formally teaching you about corporate trauma? Do you even know what corporate trauma is? Another question for instructors and professors. What percentage of your students across the campus would you guess are trauma-informed? How often do your students formally hear about corporate trauma at your college or university? If you were to poll your students using a scale of 1 to 10 on how thorough their knowledge of workplace trauma is, what do you believe would be the average number? What specifically has been taught to your students about workplace trauma? Was it powerful, impactful, and usable? What is your involvement with your students right after they have received an offer from a company and have accepted it? Do you have ongoing required education on corporate trauma for your students? Or is it simply, we just post flyers and students show up if they want to? What classes have professors made responsible for making their student body trauma literate? Do your students know the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder, corporate trauma, workplace trauma, and post-traumatic unemployment disorder? Do your students know how to handle manager aggression and attack? Have you talked about it? Have you taught about it? Was the training that your institution offered campus-wide? Are you training your students on how to identify employee targeting? Are your students educated on the symptoms of post-traumatic unemployment disorder? Do you think your students would benefit from being trauma-informed? Do you think your students would benefit from knowing about corporate trauma and post-traumatic unemployment disorder and being able to identify it early on? How many initiatives, programs, and workshops has your department had to prepare your students for the realities of the workplace? Do you think those managers who regularly inflict trauma on employees as a weapon are going to inform your graduating students early on that that is what they do? Do you think it is a part of new hire orientation? Do you think any of your students who enter corporate America could be on medication or possibly be committed to a mental institution at some point in their lives because of their inability to deflect trauma? What percentage of your students do you think would know how to navigate and survive in the workplace? What percentage of your students know how to strategically deflect corporate trauma and termination? Do your students know what to do if they suffer from corporate trauma? If you have had workshops on corporate trauma, did you measure the impact it had on each and every one of your students? And when I say each, I mean each student. Is your psychology department involved with corporate trauma literacy and trauma deflection in conjunction with your undergraduate and graduate business programs? If not, then why not? Are your students being trained with an eye to identify a toxic workplace or manager? Do they know what to do when they are in a panic attack? Have your students been trained to decode the behaviors and responses of their managers, something that is critical and will directly impact the length of time that they are employed? Do your students know what to do in an undesired situation while in a corporate position before it is too late? Have your students been trained on behaviors that will help them climb the corporate ladder as well as cause them to fall off? Do you think it would be worthwhile to have workshops that help your students know when their managers have set them on a path of termination and what to do about it? Do your students know what EEOC is? Do your students know when to engage a labor lawyer in an employee matter? Do your students know about company employee hotlines, how they work, when they benefit them, and when they do not? Do your students know about the tort to inflict emotional distress on an employee? Do you feel you are doing enough to prepare and educate your students to actively deflect corporate trauma and better navigate through corporate America? How do you know that? How are you, your department, and your institution measuring accountability and effectiveness? Are you engaging your alumni on these matters? Are you aware that many employees are in tremendous pain and suffering, as well as on mental medication because of their job situations? Are you aware that there are people suffering from corporate trauma and post-traumatic unemployment disorder and do not know it? Are you aware that colleges and universities in particular, undergraduate business schools and MBA programs, can do much better in producing trauma-informed graduates? As a matter of fact, business schools should be taking the lead. Every single one of your students on your campus should understand what workplace trauma, corporate trauma, and post-traumatic unemployment disorder are before starting any professional job. Let us help you achieve that declaration.